Chapter 1. The Forgotten Ring. Miss Arabella Worthington was not a woman easily forgotten. She had dedicated her life to protocol, impeccable routine, and the preservation of the Worthington name, even though the family fortune had withered a decade earlier. At 67, she retained the appearance of a Victorian governess, a tight bun, lips as thin as a letter edge, and a voice that could split a teacup with the mere mention of someone's ill-bred name. Every Thursday, without fail, she hosted 5 o'clock tea in the library of the mansion at Summerfield Chase. She always invited the same select group of people: her orphaned niece Judith, the local vicar, Dr. Howard Penrose, her neighbour Colonel Macfarlane, retired and deaf in one ear, and Miss Lydia Fairfax, a young artist who lived in the greenhouse-turned-studio at the far end of the grounds. It was, as Arabella would have described it, a balanced social composition, though to Poirot later it seemed like a collection of secrets tied together with porcelain thread. It was during one of those afternoons that the inexplicable event occurred. The grandfather clock had struck 5 with a low note when Judith entered with the spode china tray, placing each cup and saucer with almost mechanical precision. The aroma of Earl Grey tea mingled with that of lemon sponge and the buttery scent of warm scones. Conversations were soft, measured, wrapped in the British mist of decorum. Lydia spoke of an unfinished portrait. The colonel tediously mentioned some past battle, and the vicar seemed content to nod between sips. It was then that Arabella stopped dead in her tracks, her gaze fixed on the silver spoon in her cup. The entire room seemed to notice the change in temperature before she spoke sharply. "Where is my ring?" A silence fell over the room, like an unexpected shadow. Everyone looked at her. "The sapphire?" Judith asked, with a note of concern. Arabella raised her right hand. Her ring finger, normally adorned with a sapphire set in white gold, was conspicuous only by its absence. "I took it off before serving the tea," she said slowly. "I left it, as always, on the silver tray on the sideboard, and now it's gone." Lydia put down her cup with a soft clink. The colonel frowned, and the vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Maybe it fell off," Dr. Penrose suggested. "Sometimes the ring can slip off without you noticing." "On a flat tray," Arabella replied with a steely gaze. "No, doctor, it's been stolen." And then he pronounced it, as if issuing a sentence. This wasn't a simple loss. In a house where everything was catalogued, where every napkin had embroidered initials, the disappearance of a ring wasn't a coincidence. It was a crime. In the following hours, the sideboard was inspected, the vases emptied, the cushions shaken out. Judith wept. Lydia acted offended, and the colonel clumsily suggested that perhaps the non-existent house cat had taken it. But the ring was nowhere to be found. It was the next day that Miss Worthington, not trusting the local police, wrote a letter. A brief, meticulous missive, faintly scented with lavender. She addressed it to a name she had only heard in the most refined circles of London, but whose fame preceded her even in the quiet confines of Summerfield. Mr. Hercule Poirot. The Belgian detective received the letter in his London apartment with his usual delight in the enigmatic. The handwriting revealed a control-obsessed personality. The dry, precise writing betrayed both contempt and desperation. Poirot smoothed the paper, folded it with geometric perfection, and smiled. "A ring stolen during 5 o'clock tea," he murmured. "Ah, mon ami Hastings, how beautiful crime is when it has manners." And with that phrase he decided to take the first train to the countryside. The crime, it seemed, had touched the tea china, and as Poirot knew only too well, where a jewel is stolen from a room full of refined people, there's always more than just a thief. There's pride, fear, secrets, and perhaps a murder in the making. Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Lord of the Small Details. The train descended through the Wiltshire countryside, shrouded in a light mist, as if even nature hesitated to reveal too much of itself. The express from London was punctual, of course. Monsieur Hercule Poirot would tolerate nothing less. In his first-class compartment, the Belgian detective went over the letter once more, like someone caressing a puzzle yet to be solved. "A ring," he said quietly, "but not just any ring. One deliberately left on a tray and disappeared during a perfectly timed tea party. He adjusted his pocket square with an automatic gesture and looked at himself in the small, portable mirror he always carried with him. His mustache was in order. His hat, pearl grey, short-brimmed, hung symmetrically on its hook. Crime, according to his philosophy, should not be approached with disorder or haste. The mind should be as polished as one's shoes. The chaos outside was a reflection of the inside, and he, Hercule Poirot, did not allow disorder in either of them. Upon arriving at Summerfield Station, a young man with a gentle face was waiting for him, holding a sign that, curiously, didn't say Poirot, but Monsieur de Londres. Poirot smiled. He loved the provincial anonymity. "It's me, young man," he said as he approached. "My name is Hercule Poirot." "Oh, excuse me, sir. Miss Worthington wasn't sure how to spell it," said the young man, helping him with the suitcase. "I'm Peter, the gardener. Well, apprentice gardener, if I'm honest." Poirot nodded with interest. Often the humble observed things that the refined ignored. The walk from the station to the mansion was short, but it was long enough for Poirot to notice several details. The slightly misaligned iron gate, the overgrown rosebush by the main path, and the way Peter spoke with a mixture of admiration and nervousness about his landlady. "Miss Arabella has everything written down in a notebook," Peter explained, lowering his voice, "right down to the number of teaspoons of sugar the vicar puts in his tea." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "So, mon ami, it will be difficult for a crime to go unnoticed. And yet, it has happened." Summerfield Chase rose before them, an Edwardian mansion with Gothic touches, with columns that seemed to hold secrets, and tall windows like alert eyes. The front door opened before they even rang the bell. Judith, the niece, was waiting for them. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with a discreet beauty. She wore a pale blue dress that contrasted with her tense expression. Her voice, however, was polite and clear. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming so soon. My aunt is waiting for you in the library." Poirot bowed slightly. "Mademoiselle, it's a pleasure and a promise. I will find the truth, however a pleasure and a promise. I will find the truth, however small it may be." As they made their way through the corridors, Poirot noticed more. A small patch of dried mud in the corner of a Persian rug. A vase moved half a centimeter off its axis, and the slight tremor in Judith's voice as she opened the library door. Arabella Worthington was waiting for him, seated in a chair upholstered in maroon velvet. The sunlight, filtered through the stained glass windows, gave her an almost ecclesiastical air. She didn't stand, but greeted him with a nod that was more formal than friendly. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust you have come with a clear mind and sharp judgment." "Always, mademoiselle," he replied, sitting down opposite her, uninvited. "Tell me everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how insignificant. The murderer, pardon me, the thief always counts on the victim's ignorance of the details." Arabella frowned at the lapse but proceeded with her account with the precision of a chronicler. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Tea began as usual. Judith brought the tray. All the guests were in their usual places. At 5:10, I noticed the ring was not on my finger. At 5:11, I remembered I had left it on the sideboard next to the Wedgwood vase. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Why did you take it off?" "Because spoiled china irritates my skin if I use it while serving," she replied dryly. "I've been doing it for 20 years. It's a habit." And then, "We checked everything. No one left the room. There are no secondary entrances or exits. In short, Monsieur Poirot, the ring was stolen by someone who is still under this roof." Poirot folded his hands. "And you suspect someone in particular?" Arabella looked at him coldly. "I suspect everyone." Poirot rose gently. "Perfect. A closed circle. I like it. Could you introduce me to everyone present, one by one?" Arabella nodded with the gravity of a queen summoning her subjects. "Judith, of course, my niece. She's lived with me since she lost her parents. Dr. Penrose, a retired physician, cultured, polite, and a keen ornithologist. Colonel Macfarlane, an old military man with more medals than words. Vicar Bellamy, pleasant but not very perceptive. And finally, Miss Lydia Fairfax, an artist. Bohemian, according to some. Insolent, according to others." Poirot nodded slowly, making a mental note of names and characteristics. 5 guests, all acquaintances, all with access. "Mademoiselle, is there anything else you wish to tell me?" Arabella hesitated. For a moment, her eyes wandered towards the window. "Yes," he said finally. "Someone moved the Wedgwood vase. I know exactly how. It was positioned. And after tea, it was slightly turned." Poirot leaned forward. "Ah, voilà. That's the kind of detail I'm interested in. Thank you, mademoiselle. My little grey cells are already working." That evening, Poirot dined alone in his room, the cold salad and a small glass of white wine that Judith politely offered him. As he ate, he went over each item in his mind. 5 people, 1 missing piece, 1 displaced object, 1 silver tray, 1 cup of tea. And intuition, like a whisper, told him that it wasn't just a robbery. No, it was a warning. Poirot turned out the light early, but not to sleep. His thoughts were already organizing the invisible pieces of the puzzle. And tomorrow, the mask parade would begin. Chapter 3. Conversations on the Edge of Silence. The next morning the fog had left the fields, but not the mood inside Summerfield Chase. The air in the house was thick, as if every corner was waiting to be interrogated. Hercule Poirot descended with his usual punctuality at 8:30, impeccably dressed in a pale taupe suit and a starched handkerchief that seemed to defy gravity. In the breakfast room Judith served him tea without speaking. Her face, though serene, carried the tension of someone who had slept badly and dreamed worse. Poirot watched her without urgency, letting silence do what words could not. "Is there anything in particular worrying you this morning, mademoiselle?" he said finally, taking his cup. Judith started slightly. "Excuse me?" "It's nothing," said Poirot with a faint smile. "Only when a young woman puts in 3 spoonfuls of sugar instead of 2, and then doesn't even stir, one suspects her mind is elsewhere." Judith blushed. "Sorry, I didn't notice." Poirot waved a hand politely. "Don't apologize, mademoiselle. Just tell me, what do you think of the robbery?" She hesitated. Then she leaned slightly toward him, like someone breaking a carefully sealed secret. "I think it wasn't a robbery." Poirot looked at her carefully. "No? Number, it was a message. For my aunt." "A message?" "She'll never say it. But that ring, it's not just a family heirloom. It's the symbol of something, of an oath, of a very personal memory that no one else has the right to touch. And you think someone here knew? Yes, Judith said with certainty, her eyes fixed on the cup. Someone knew and wanted to hurt her. Poirot nodded, like someone tucking a clue away in an invisible drawer. May I ask you something, mademoiselle? Why do you live with your aunt? Judith hesitated. I don't have anyone else and, well, she always offered me a roof over my head, though not always a home. And the other guests? What's your relationship with them? Judith looked down. Doctor. Penrose treats me with respect, though I think he frowns on anything he can't diagnose. The Colonel, well, he lives in another century. I like Lydia, but my aunt can't stand her. And the vicar, he's just there. He's always there. Poirot gave a slight bow. Thank you, mademoiselle. You observe with subtlety. We'll have occasion to talk later, shall we? At 9:30, Arabella summoned everyone to the East Gallery, a room that had once housed portraits and now served as a reception room when the library was too informal. Poirot, naturally, was ready before anyone else, already with his leather notebook in hand. One by one they entered. Dr. Penrose with a measured stride, Lydia with a shawl hanging barely over one shoulder, the Colonel with his military cane and a dry look, and Vicar Bellamy, who was smiling as if he still didn't know what he was doing there. Arabella spoke with her tone of a judge without a robe. Monsieur Poirot wishes to speak with each of you, separately. I ask that you cooperate with the utmost frankness. Poirot bowed his thanks slightly. Thank you, mademoiselle. It won't be long. Just a few questions to understand the atmosphere of the crime. The first to stay was Dr. Penrose. He had the grey eyes and thin lips of someone accustomed to observing without being observed. Doctor, Poirot began, you were present at the tea party. Did you notice anything unusual? Just the tea itself. It was more bitter than usual, he said tersely. Apart from that, nothing. Are you in the habit of looking at the sideboard where Miss Worthington leaves her ring? Should I have it? Not necessarily. But sometimes medicine requires unintentional observation. Did you notice anyone approaching the tray? Penrose thought. I don't remember. Although Judith got up once to get more milk. Poirot noted. And you, Doctor, have any opinion on the significance of the robbery? The doctor stared at him. My opinion is irrelevant, monsieur. Theft is an act. The why is for novelists. I only deal with what's left afterward. Ah, but the why is everything, said Poirot gently. The why is the map. The act is only the blot on the page. Penrose watched him without blinking. Then I hope your map is clear. Next was Lydia Fairfax. She wore a linen scarf tied in her hair and smelled of turpentine and lilacs. Are you going to ask me if I stole it, monsieur? He said, without sitting down. I'm going to ask you if you felt the atmosphere during tea was different. Lydia sighed. Arabella always makes everything feel tense. If tea were sharp, it would cut your tongue. But yes, that afternoon, there was something strange. The Colonel was especially quiet. And Judith. She seemed upset. And you? I pretended not to care, like always. But Arabella hates me. Why do you say that? Because he can't control me, Lydia replied, finally sitting down. And that's something he won't tolerate. I don't belong in his world. I paint. I live alone. I go to bed late. In his eyes, I'm a warning. What if the robbery was more than a warning? Lydia looked at him, and for the first time her tone lost its edge. Then I'm afraid this is just the beginning. The Colonel was brief. He said he didn't see well and didn't hear well, but that he never stole anything from anyone, not even the Germans, when he could. Poirot listened politely, noticing that the Colonel's walking stick had fresh mud on the tip. Curious, it hadn't rained for days. "Did you go out into the garden yesterday after tea?" "Just to smoke my pipe." "Why?" "You're welcome, Colonel. Mud sometimes visits the most honourable shoes. Last was Vicar Bellamy." He had an easy smile and glassy eyes. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I'm afraid I'm of no help. I'm always the last to know about everything." "Sometimes, father," said Poirot with a bow, "the last to know are the first to see." Bellamy laughed. "Well, I saw little. Lydia was restless." The Colonel was snoring in his chair. Judith seemed to fear silence. And Arabella was Arabella. "And you, father?" Bellamy thought about it for a moment. "I thought about Sunday's sermon. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew 6:21. Poirot inclined his head slowly. "Thank you, father. A good verse, and perhaps a good clue." As he closed his notebook, Poirot still had no answer. But he already had something much more valuable: the contradictions. And in the contradictions, the truth was always hidden. Chapter 4. The Empty Chair and the Broken Memory. Evening descended slowly over Summerfield Chase, tinting the walls amber and melting the edges of things with a soft, deceptive light. Poirot, after his morning interviews, retired to the library with a cup of tea. Just one, unsweetened, with a slice of lemon that he inspected minutely before allowing it to float in the infusion. On the table, he placed a blank sheet of paper. His fingers, crossed over his chest, tapped a methodical rhythm as his gaze scanned the shelves, not for their books, but for the arrangement of the objects within them. An antique clock struck 4. 2 minutes later, it stopped. "Exactly," he murmured. Judith entered quietly. Poirot stood up with a slight gesture. "Ah, mademoiselle. Tell me, was there anyone else who had access to the drawing-room during tea besides the guests?" She shook her head. "No servants, no gardeners. Mrs. Bates, the cook, never comes in when there are visitors." Poirot nodded. "And the back door?" "Locked. My aunt checks it 3 times before 5. She has an almost theatrical obsession with punctuality and security." "Then it's a crime from within," Poirot said gently, "like a watch damaged from within." Judith hesitated. "Do you think it's something more serious, monsieur?" "I can't say yet, but I'm disturbed by the presence of something invisible." "Is anything missing?" she asked. Poirot shook his head with a faint smile. "On the contrary, something that's unnecessary." Judith frowned in confusion. Poirot dismissed her politely and, when he was alone, took out a small leather notebook with worn covers. In it, he wrote, "Everyone had a chance. They all had reasons, if you look at them from the right angle. But I still don't have the detail out of place." Just then, a figure knocked softly on the door. It was Lydia Fairfax. She was hatless, her hair dishevelled, her eyes bright. "May I speak to you, sir?" she said. "Just a few minutes." Poirot motioned for him to sit down. He did so with mechanical grace, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor. "You'd think I know something," he said suddenly. "Do you know?" "I don't know for sure, but I feel it. Something changed in that room, just before your aunt noticed the ring." "What kind of change?" Lydia looked at him, trying to form precise words. "It was as if the atmosphere sank, as if we all felt something had been said, unsaid." Poirot inclined his head. "A charged silence?" "Yes, and it didn't last more than a few seconds. But it was real, as if we'd all heard an invisible echo." "And then?" Arabella stared at her hand, and then she said, "Where's my ring?" "But, monsieur, I swear she already knew." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "How did you know?" "I don't know. Maybe he noticed it in the teapot's reflection, or maybe he expected it, as if someone had made him a promise. A threat, or a warning." Poirot was silent. Then he stood up, walked to the far sideboard, and stood in front of it. It was an antique oak cabinet with a surface that dimly reflected the light. A Wedgwood vase still stood there. He moved it just a few inches. The difference was minimal, but noticeable to someone like Arabella. Poirot examined the surface. There were no visible fingerprints, only a speck of displaced dust that glittered in the backlight. "Someone put their hand here," he said quietly, "and then they took it away." "Did you find anything?" Lydia asked from the armchair. Poirot shook his head. "Not yet. But tell me, mademoiselle, did you notice the empty chair?" "What chair?" Poirot smiled. "Exactly. In a room with 6 people, 7 chairs were set out, but one remained unoccupied, next to the piano, slightly withdrawn, as if someone had been there, or as if they were waiting for someone to arrive." Lydia paled. "I hadn't noticed. Most don't. But Judith does. When she came in with the tray, her gaze flickered there for a moment. Very faint. Very quick. And what does it mean? I still don't know if it was a mistake or a memory." Lydia remained silent. "Or a memory." Lydia remained silent, then stood up. Her voice, previously firm, cracked slightly. "I'm warning you, Monsieur Poirot. Everyone here is hiding something, even Judith. And some secrets are so deeply rooted, they're willing to kill just to keep them from coming to light." Poirot nodded, dismissing her with a courtesy that concealed more than it revealed. Then he walked slowly to the empty chair. He examined it. It was dust-free. It showed no signs of recent use, but there was a small mark on the carpet just below it. A ring, circular, light. The shape a cup leaves when someone gently places it down. But no one had sat there. Or had they? Poirot made a mental note. That brand shouldn't exist. And in that small mistake there was a crack in the perfection of the crime. That evening, Judith entered the library with an envelope in her hand. She extended it to Poirot without speaking. He took it. Opening it, he found a sheet of paper folded in 3 parts. A simple, almost childlike drawing, a ring on a tray, and beneath it, a sentence written in clumsy handwriting. "Remember what you promised." Poirot looked up slowly. "Where did you find this?" "On my pillow," Judith said, her voice barely audible. "This morning." "And have you shown it to anyone else?" Number Poirot folded the paper with mathematical precision and put it in his notebook. "Mademoiselle, the truth has many faces, but lies have only one, and they tend to be afraid of mirrors." "What do you mean?" "That we are entering the heart of the labyrinth." Chapter 5. Echoes in broken porcelain. Where everything seemed intact, a crack was waiting to be heard. The next morning, Summerfield Chase seemed calmer, but Hercule Poirot knew that this calm was merely an appearance. Like fine china that hides an invisible crack until the moment it falls to the floor. The mist had disappeared, and the garden shone with the dampness of early morning. From his window, Poirot watched Peter, the young gardener, picking withered flowers. He moved his hands clumsily, but also with a particular kind of care that caught Poirot's attention. No one so young ever displayed such precision unless they had a reason or an injury that had forced them to learn it. Poirot descended with his usual calm. Judith had left breakfast for him on the veranda: toast, cranberry jam, and a perfectly boiled egg. Beside the tray was a note. "I went for a walk. I needed some fresh air. I'll be back before noon. Judith." There was no signature, just his initial in a more hurried than usual handwriting. Poirot ate slowly, listening to every crunch of the bread, every tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. Something didn't fit. The drawing of the ring and the phrase in yesterday's note were still fresh in his mind. "Remember what you promised." But who was that message addressed to? Judith? Arabella? Or even the real culprit? After breakfast, Poirot decided to go out. He walked down the corridor to the tea-room where it had all begun. The furniture was neat, the sideboard tidy. The Wedgwood vase was still there, but something was different. Poirot noticed it immediately, a small crack in the base, hidden if one looked at it from the front, but visible when leaning over. He bent down carefully. The crack was fresh. Someone had moved it. Not on the day of the robbery, but after. But who? "Looking for something, Monsieur Poirot?" The voice came from the doorway. It was Dr. Penrose, dressed in his usual dark suit and leather gloves, despite the growing heat. Poirot straightened up. "Just watching. Broken things always talk, Doctor. You just have to bend down to hear them." Penrose smiled stiffly. "I'm afraid I don't have an ear for porcelain. Do you think the ring had value beyond its aesthetics?" Poirot looked at him carefully. "I think so. The symbolic value of objects often exceeds their weight in gold. The heart remembers what the wallet forgets." Penrose approached slowly, his eyes scanning what Poirot had already seen. Arabella had a peculiar relationship with that ring. Sometimes she fondled it as if it were a relic, but I never learned its origin. "You never asked?" "I'm not a man of questions. I observe, diagnose, act." Poirot smiled slightly. "And yet, Doctor, the most accurate diagnoses come from questions, not symptoms." Penrose looked uncomfortable, bowed goodbye, and left without another word. Poirot stood there for a moment longer, then turned to the piano. The bench was closed. He opened it slowly. Inside, only yellowed, dusty sheet music. But among them, almost as if someone had carelessly dropped it, was a sheet of paper folded in four. He unfolded it with great care. It was a musical note scribbled in pencil, just a simple melodic line, and unfinished. And in the corner, a word: "always." Poirot examined it. The handwriting didn't match Judith's, nor Arabella's. It was more fluid, artistic. It could have been Lydia's. But why keep an unfinished melody next to an instrument that no one had played in years? Shortly afterwards, Poirot found Peter by the rose bushes, cleaning the thorns with a small pair of scissors. "Hello, young Peter." The boy turned around, surprised. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot. Need something?" "A brief conversation, if you don't mind." Peter put the scissors down on a stone and wiped his hands on his apron. "Of course. Did you know about Miss Worthington's ring?" Peter frowned. "Yes, of course. He always carried it. Sometimes when he called me to get something from the living room, I saw it shining under the lamp." "And you knew I took it off when I served the tea?" "Only sometimes. I think it was when it was hot. He always said it took a toll on his dignity," he added, smiling. Poirot observed this detail with interest. "Have you noticed anything strange this week?" Peter hesitated. "Yes. Well, there was something strange about Mrs. Judith." "Judith?" "Yes. The day before the robbery I saw her crying in the garden. She was alone. Then I saw her take a leaf out of her pocket and tear it into pieces. She buried it near the willow tree. Some sauce? Yes. There. He pointed with his finger. Poirot inclined his head. Thank you, young Peter. You have the eye of a gardener and the memory of an observer. Minutes later, Poirot was heading for the willow. The ground was damp and soft. Using a handkerchief to keep clean, he dug at the spot Peter had indicated. It didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for, a small, damp paper wrapper, still with visible ink fragments. The writing was illegible, but a repeated word could still be seen among the scraps. Lie. And in one of the largest fragments, barely visible, it wasn't about the money. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. A web was beginning to unravel. It wasn't entirely visible, but the knots were already there. At lunchtime, Arabella summoned Poirot to the greenhouse, a place she normally used only for orchids. She found him standing there, surrounded by steamed glass and hanging plants like green spectres. Is your investigation progressing, sir? Poirot inclined his head. Every step brings me closer to the center of the labyrinth, mademoiselle. Arabella didn't smile. I received a letter this morning. Anonymous. It says the ring was returned. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And was that so? Number, I checked everything. Nothing. And have you shown this letter to anyone else? Number, not even Judith. He's got enough on his mind already. Poirot studied her face. There was something more to it. A hardness that wasn't mere severity. Mademoiselle, what does that ring represent? Arabella stared at him. For a moment she seemed to break, but then her voice was firm. It represents a decision that has haunted me for 30 years. A love. A mistake. Poirot waited, but she said no more. That evening, before dinner, Poirot returned to the tea room. This time he sat in the empty chair. He remained motionless. He imagined the scene, the tray arriving, the guests talking, the tense atmosphere. And then he knew. No who, but how. And in the how was the loose thread that would lead to the culprit. When he got up, he saw something else. On the inside of the table leg, almost imperceptible, someone had carved a letter with a knife. A J. Judith, or someone who wanted to point her out. The psychological game had begun, and Hercule Poirot was ready to return the play. Chapter 6. The Shadows of Tea. The rain came unannounced. It began as a murmur, a whisper on the greenhouse glass, and then transformed into a symphony of distinct drops tapping on the tiles of Summerfield Chase. The mansion, which had already seemed to hold a secret in every tile, now breathed with the cold, damp breath of English storms. Hercule Poirot, sitting in front of the fireplace in his room, watched the fire's irregular dance. His thoughts were as sharp as the tallest flame, yet also marked by the ambiguity of shadows. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but the picture remained partial. The lost ring, the note on the pillow, the empty chair, the unfinished melody, the word lie buried under the willow, and now a carved letter, J, too crude to be a signature, too visible to be an accident. At 6 o'clock sharp, Poirot descended. He had requested that the 5 guests join him once more in the library. It wasn't the final meeting that, in his world, was always reserved for the last move. But it was a prelude, a deliberate movement on the board to study reactions, not responses. When he walked in, everyone was already there. Judith, with her hands clasped and an expression of forced concentration. Lydia, leaning on the arm of the chair, like a sphinx with a paintbrush. Colonel Macfarlane, standing like a statue, though his eyes were increasingly cloudy. Dr. Penrose, who was leafing through a book without reading it, and Vicar Bellamy, his hands folded in his lap, as if he were waiting for a confession he didn't know whether to give or receive. Poirot gently closed the door. The soft click of the latch seemed to seal the room. "My lords and ladies," he said in a calm voice, "I thank you for coming. I'd like to briefly review the events that took place with you, not because I think any of you have forgotten what happened, but because sometimes, when you repeat a story, your mind slacks, and the truth slips away." Nobody spoke. Poirot walked slowly, stopping at the central carpet. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, tea begins. Judith enters with the tray. Miss Worthington, as always, removes her ring and places it on the sideboard tray. All the guests are present. No one else enters. No one else leaves. And yet, the ring disappears. A whisper of discomfort ran through the room. Poirot continued. Miss Worthington discovers the absence almost immediately. She searches the place. She questions authoritatively, but she doesn't call the police. Instead, she writes a letter to me. He looked directly at Arabella, who stood with her back as straight as a tower. "Why, mademoiselle? Why didn't you trust the local police?" Arabella narrowed her eyes. "Because this wasn't a common robbery. It was a message for me." "And the message? Did you understand it?" A silence. "Yes," he said finally, "although I still don't know who sent it." Poirot inclined his head. He doesn't know for sure, but he has a feeling. He turned to Lydia. "You said there was a different atmosphere that day, as if everyone had heard something without anyone saying a word. Can you describe it?" Lydia crossed her legs slowly. "It was as if the air had become heavy, as if everyone was remembering something at once. A moment shared, but denied." "Interesting," said Poirot, "because the crime wasn't limited to the act. It was, rather, an invocation. Someone was evoking a past." "What kind of past?" Penrose asked, crossing his arms. "One who still lives within these walls, who has been buried beneath the garden, written on unfinished sheet music, and engraved on wood." He then turned to Judith. "Mademoiselle, will you explain to me why you tore up a letter and buried it under the willow?" Judith turned pale. "How did you know?" "A very observant young gardener, as he should be." Judith swallowed. "It was an old letter, from my mother. It had nothing to do with this." "And why destroy it just the day before the robbery?" Silence. "Did your mother mention the ring?" More silence. Poirot took a step closer. "Judith, was the ring your mother's?" Everyone turned to her. Judith closed her eyes. Her voice came out shaky. "Yeah." Arabella let out a small sigh, but not in surprise. "It was hers," Judith continued. "I'd kept it for years. When she died, my aunt claimed it as family, saying it belonged to her. I never disputed it until recently." "And what happened?" Judith looked up. There wasn't anger in her eyes, but something deeper, disappointment. "I found another letter. My mother said the ring was given to her in secret, by someone of this house, not by my father. A weighty gift, a commitment, something to be returned only if she wished it." Lydia took a deep breath. The colonel frowned. Penrose looked away. Poirot said softly, "And you thought your aunt had taken it unfairly?" "I believed it," Judith said, holding back tears. "And I thought about getting him back. But I didn't." "No?" "Non, monsieur. I swear. I could have. But that night, I decided not to touch it. Someone else did." Poirot nodded slowly. Then he went to the piano. He placed the sheet of paper with the incomplete melody on the lid. "Does anyone recognize this note?" No one answered, but Lydia's eyes betrayed her. "It's yours, isn't it?" Lydia shrugged. "It's a melody I started, but it doesn't have a name. No story." "And why was it kept on the piano bench?" "I don't know. I haven't seen her in years." Poirot turned to the group. "And you know what I find most interesting?" "No, I haven't seen her in years." Poirot turned to the group. "And you know what I find most intriguing? That this melody, though incomplete, repeats a sequence that suggests a word, a musical code word, Jade. The notes match. The melody was a hidden portrait, a name, perhaps Judith's." Arabella stiffened. "That's absurd." "Or perhaps not," said Poirot. "Perhaps someone composed this melody as a way of recording a relationship that was never official. Perhaps someone wanted the ring to return to the right hands." "Are you suggesting there's a hidden father?" Penrose interrupted coldly. "I'm suggesting," said Poirot, his voice low but sharp, "that the theft of the ring was not motivated by greed. It was motivated by redemption." The room seemed to close in on itself. "And to find the culprit," Poirot concluded, "I won't look in pockets, but in remorse." He headed for the door. "Tomorrow I'll ask everyone to gather around once more, because I have one last play to make, one that will reveal not only who took the ring, but why someone was willing to kill for him." Everyone looked at him in surprise. "The wife?" Poirot opened the door. "Yes, because, my friends, this story hasn't taken its toll yet, and the price always comes." Chapter 7. The Second Silence. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered. Along the central hallway of Summerfield Chase, the windows still shed belated drops, as if the weather refused to fully release what the house also seemed to resist letting go, an unspoken truth, long contained. Poirot, true to his meticulous nature, began the day by checking the rooms, not out of curiosity, but out of principle. He had learned long ago that rooms spoke of the souls of those who inhabited them, not with words, but with silences. Judith's was plain. Neatly arranged books, a small portrait of her mother on the nightstand, and a folder of drawings where landscape sketches were repeated with slight changes in light. But on the dresser, folded with excessive precision, was the blue dress she had worn the day of the robbery. Poirot touched it with a gloved finger. "People sometimes dress in memories," he murmured, "not in fabric." He continued his way to Lydia's room. There the order was only apparent. The paintings, stacked like secrets, revealed to the expert eye that some had been moved recently. An easel with a canvas covered by a sheet caught his attention. He didn't lift it. Not yet. In his world, revelations weren't forced, were conquered. The Colonel's room was what one would expect: military austerity, a Bible with worn corners, an unloaded pistol hanging as a relic, and a small black notebook under the pillow. Poirot left it untouched, but made a note. The Colonel still slept armed, even though he said otherwise. The vicar, on the other hand, lived among contradictions. The crucifix hung crooked. A worn edition of the Confessions of St. Augustine marked with dried petals, and a crumpled piece of paper in the wastebasket, still legible despite the attempted destruction. Poirot unfolded it. It was a handwritten quotation. "You shall not lie, even if the truth burns you like a burning ember." It was not signed, but it is underlined twice. At breakfast, Arabella did not appear. Judith served the tea with barely contained clumsiness, and the silence was absolute until Lydia, with her usual mixture of provocation and artistry, broke the stillness. "Did we all sleep well?" he said, slowly turning the spoon in his cup. "Or was someone visited by ring-shaped dreams?" The colonel glared at her. Penrose raised an eyebrow. "Some of us prefer to sleep," he said. "Others prefer to act." In silence. Poirot put down his cup. He didn't speak. He just watched. Words didn't interest him that morning, only the pauses. And then Bates, the cook, arrived, pale as linen napkins. "Excuse me, Miss Judith. There's a problem." Judith jumped up. "What's wrong?" Bates swallowed. "Mrs. Worthington isn't responding. Her door is closed. She hasn't come down. And her breakfast is still uneaten." An invisible lightning bolt crossed the room. Poirot was already getting up. "Leave me." Arabella's room was locked from the inside. Judith knocked once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. "Aunt, it's me." Poirot stepped forward. "Is there another way in?" Judith nodded. "A secondary door. Through the study. It leads to the same hallway." They went that way. When the door opened, a cold smell enveloped them. Not death, not yet. About absence. Arabella was sitting in her armchair, fully dressed, with her back straight, as if she were waiting for someone. Only his eyes were closed, and his face motionless. Judith screamed. Poirot didn't. He came closer, took a pulse. There wasn't one. The body was still warm. "Call Penrose," he said, without raising his voice. Within minutes, the doctor was there. He examined him. "There are no signs of violence. But there's something on her lips. Do you see that? Like a slight stain." Poirot nodded. "Poison?" "I can't confirm it without proof, but yes, something was ingested." "Voluntarily?" Penrose shrugged. Arabella Worthington wasn't a woman to accept defeat or revelations. Perhaps this was her answer to both. Judith collapsed into a chair. "No, I don't think so. My aunt wouldn't take her own life. Not like that." Poirot looked at her. "Not like that?" "She would have left a note. Something. A judgment. A closure." Poirot nodded slowly. "So, if there's no note, there's no ending. Just a new act." The local police were alerted, but Poirot, as usual, became the point of reference. Inspector Morris arrived mid-morning, wearing an expression of dismay and measured respect. "Monsieur Poirot, what a situation." "Oui, Inspector, and believe me, the worst is yet to come." "Suspected murder?" Poirot did not reply immediately. "I suspect a chess game that has reached its penultimate move." That afternoon, Poirot gathered the 5 present again. "Arabella Worthington is dead," he said gravely. "We don't know yet whether it was her own doing or the work of another. But her death doesn't erase the crime. On the contrary, it consummates it." Lydia broke the silence. "Do you mean that the theft of the ring and his death are connected?" "That's what I say, and more. They both have the same roots, not in gold, but in the past. A past of broken promises, hidden names, and hearts divided by fear." He turned to Judith. "You said the ring was given secretly. By whom?" Judith shuddered. "I don't know. My mother never wrote it. She just said it was someone she shouldn't have. That if it got out, it would be the end." The colonel stood up abruptly. "Enough. This theater is a disgrace." Poirot turned slowly. "So tell me, Colonel, why did you write this letter?" He handed him a piece of paper. The colonel read it. He paled. He recognized it. He had written it 30 years ago. "I love you, but I'll never be able to recognize you. If a daughter is born, protect her as if she were my own. Don't sign this. Burn it. Bone. Don't sign this. Burn it." Judith read it over her shoulder. "That." Poirot spoke in a low voice. "Arabella didn't burn it. She kept it, as punishment, as a souvenir. And you, Colonel, You wrote this. Absolute silence. The colonel sat down. He didn't deny it. Lydia, on the other hand, stood up. So, the ring was a promise that Arabella stole. Poirot nodded. And someone tried to return it, symbolically, through theft. The vicar spoke, for the first time, firmly. And she died, because the symbol became a threat. "For shame," said Poirot. "Whoever took the ring did it to make a truth known. But Arabella wasn't about to be exposed." Judith covered her mouth. "Do you think that she—" Poirot looked at her. "I think someone else confronted her. Someone who knew, or who found out. And in that conversation, a line was crossed. So, she was murdered?" Poirot did not reply. But in her gaze, the path to climax had already been laid out. One that began not with a crime, but with a promise made 3 decades ago. Chapter 8. The Broken Promise. Dusk fell over Summerfield Chase with a restrained silence, as if the air itself refused to disturb the already charged atmosphere. Arabella Worthington's death had brought no relief. On the contrary, it had cast a heavier shadow over the original crime, intensifying the mystery rather than solving it. Hercule Poirot, as if feeling the weight of every second, walked slowly along the east gallery, his shiny shoes barely making a sound on the marble floor. The colonel's letter, that oath sealed by cowardice, still burned in his memory. Not for its content, but for what it had revealed without words, a network of prolonged silences, of evasive glances, of lives built on pacts that never came to light. In the library, every face seemed to have aged a decade in a matter of hours. Judith's eyes were dry but glowing, as if tears had crystallized. Lydia no longer seemed a theatrical figure. Her usual irony had been replaced by a kind of bitter resignation. The colonel didn't speak. He hadn't since the letter emerged. Penrose, his lips tight, maintained a clinical distance, and Vicar Bellamy simply prayed silently. Poirot entered without ceremony. He didn't need to announce himself. His presence was already a sign that things were moving. "My friends," he said with deadly gentleness, "Mademoiselle Arabella's death has not yet been declared a murder, but its context, its timing, and its precision point to something more than despair." Judith looked up. "Are you sure it wasn't suicide?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Almost certainly. And yet, more than the poison, it was shame that killed her. But make no mistake, it wasn't hers. It was the shame others wanted to give her back." There was an awkward silence. Poirot continued. "I have reconstructed the events in detail, minute by minute. I have traced who was where, what was said, what was hidden, and even more, what no it was said." He turned to Colonel Macfarlane. "You wrote that letter, didn't you?" The colonel did not deny. "And did you ever know for sure that Judith was your daughter?" "Never. Arabella forbade me to seek him out. She told me that if I ever hinted at him, he would destroy both our lives." Poirot nodded. "And all these years, he watched from afar. He never spoke. He never acted." The colonel looked away. "I thought it was better this way. I thought with time, it would dissolve." "But secrets don't dissolve, Colonel. They settle." He turned to Lydia. "And you, Mademoiselle Fairfax, what is your part in this story?" Lydia was unfazed. "Arabella hated me, not for my art, not for my life, but for what she knew. I knew Judith's mother. We were friends. I sensed what happened. And when Judith found the letter, I confirmed what I'd always suspected." "And that motivated you to take the ring?" Lydia looked at him coldly. "Number. But I did want her to know. I wanted Judith to know that she wasn't crazy, that her mother wasn't what Arabella had told her. So, who took the ring? No one responded. Poirot bent down and took an object wrapped in black cloth from his jacket. He placed it on the table. When he opened it, the sapphire shone with an almost liquid light. "There you go," he said. "The ring forgotten at 5 o'clock tea." Everyone held their breath. "Where did you find it?" Penrose said quietly. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He continued talking, pacing around the room. It was hidden in the most obvious place, the piano. Inside the bench, under the sheet music, inside a small pillbox that didn't fit in with the rest of the contents. He looked directly at the doctor. "May I see your medicine case?" Penrose tensed. Because the box in question was identical to the ones you used to store tablets." Penrose shook his head. "That doesn't prove anything." Poirot nodded. "Number. But this does." He pulled out a small label. "Property of Dr. H. Penrose." Affixed underneath, worn but legible. A slight tremor ran through the doctor's shoulders. "Did you put it there, doctor? Were you the one who stole the ring?" Penrose did not respond. Poirot stopped in front of him. "You didn't steal it out of greed. You stole it because you knew Arabella wouldn't let the truth come out, and you could no longer tolerate the injustice." "What injustice?" Judith said, her voice breaking. "Dr. Penrose was more than a family doctor," Poirot explained. "He was the only one who knew Arabella's mental health intimately. He knew she was keeping secrets that affected everyone. He knew she had destroyed letters, tampered with memories. And above all, he knew that Arabella had lied about Judith's father." "So why the ring?" Penrose finally spoke. "Because it was the only tangible piece left of that story. Because I thought that if I removed it from where it was displayed as a symbol of power, Arabella would start to feel like someone else was in control." "And she felt it?" Penrose nodded slowly. "Yes, he confronted me that night. But he didn't confess. He just said, 'You wouldn't understand.' It was for her own good." Poirot folded his hands. "And you poisoned her?" Penrose quickly denied. "Number God, no. I just wanted him to talk. At least tell Judith the truth before he died." Poirot looked at the whole group. But someone else did want to silence her. The tension became unbearable. Poirot took another object from his pocket, a silver spoon. "Found in Arabella's cup. Traces of belladonna, a slow-acting poison. Its flavor is easily masked by strong tea, very strong." He turned to Bellamy. "Did you make the tea that morning?" The vicar jumped up. "No, Bates did it. I just carried the tray to his room, like I sometimes did." "And you didn't notice anything strange?" The vicar shuddered. "Yes, there were 2 cups, one poured, one still empty." "And the second cup?" "He wasn't there when I came back." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "So, someone else was there. Someone was there. Someone who wanted us to think about suicide. Someone who knew Arabella was on the verge of suicide." Judith stood up. "Are you saying it was premeditated?" Poirot nodded. "Yes. Very carefully planned, and I'm afraid whoever did it didn't do it just out of revenge. They did it out of fear." "Afraid of what?" "For Arabella to speak. For her to say something that would destroy a life that was still intact." He looked at Lydia, then at the Colonel, then at Judith. "Tomorrow, I'll hold the final meeting, not just to reveal the killer, but to show them what Arabella hid all these years, and why someone decided she had to die before revealing it." The clock struck 7. Poirot headed for the door. "Rest tonight if you can. Tomorrow, the ghosts will stop whispering." Chapter 9. the blue dress and the silent lie. The sky over Summerfield Chase awoke to a pale, cold, and promiseless grey. The fog, like a cloth not yet removed from the stage, crept across the fields and seeped between the cracks of the great house. It was the morning of truth. Hercule Poirot knew it, but he also knew that before the final blow there was still to be heard the quietest note of all. He had slept little, not from lack of sleep, but from too much clarity. He had reviewed the crime scene over and over again, the pieces, their positions, the visible moves, and those that had been left out of sight. The ring, the hidden note, the unfinished melody, the poisoned spoon, the colonel's letter, the nameless daughter, death without a signature. Each of those pieces was no longer ambiguous to him, but he still needed listen to those who, out of fear or loyalty, continued to hold on to their masks. And so, before the final meeting, he asked to see Judith alone. She arrived at the library shortly before 10. She was dressed in black, but not with the ritual solemnity of mourning, but with the stiffness of someone unsure how to dress a body carrying a storm inside. "You wanted to see me, monsieur?" he said in a low voice. Poirot, standing by the large window, did not turn around immediately. "Oui, mademoiselle. It's time for you to remember what you've perhaps been trying to forget." Judith frowned, confused. "I don't understand." Poirot turned slowly, his hands clasped. "The night of the robbery. You came in with the tea tray. Everyone was in their places, except one, the chair next to the piano. You looked at her, just for a moment. But it was enough." Judith took a deep breath. "Yes, but I thought it was a mistake, that someone had prepared an extra chair." "It wasn't a mistake. It was a memory, a bodily memory. Because you knew that a chair used to be occupied for someone her aunt wouldn't let sit there anymore." Judith's eyes moistened. "I'm not sure." "You're sure, mademoiselle. You've just been trained to deny it. Since you were a child." Poirot took a step closer. "You didn't just find your mother's letter. You also found the blue dress." Judith looked at him in surprise. The dress was neatly folded on her dresser, too clean, too untouched, as if she'd never touched it again since the afternoon of the robbery, because in fact she hasn't worn it since another very different afternoon, an afternoon when he heard something he'd never forget. Judith lowered her gaze. A long silence fell between them. Poirot didn't break it. He waited. He knew that words that emerge from repression must do so at their own pace. Finally she spoke. "I was a little girl. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old. I accidentally walked into the living room while my aunt and the colonel were arguing. I didn't understand much. I just remember her yelling at him, 'She'll never know. I swear. To her, you'll always be a polite stranger.' And he replied, 'I love her, even if I can't say it. But if you keep her from the truth, it will be your fault.' Then they saw me. She dragged me out. She told me I'd dreamed it, that it was a made-up nightmare." Poirot nodded tenderly. "And you believed it, until you read your mother's letter?" Judith swallowed. It all started to click. The ring. His refusal to talk about the past. The way he pushed me away whenever I asked about my father. But still, I never meant to hurt him. But he did want to do justice. I wanted to understand. That's all." Poirot lowered his voice. "And were you the one who wrote the note that said, 'Remember what you promised'?" Judith seemed about to speak, but then shook her head. "Number, I didn't write it." Poirot watched her closely. She was telling the truth. "And the ring? Did you take it?" "Number, I swear I just looked for it. I thought about doing it. But I couldn't. Poirot nodded slowly. I believe it. Because someone else was capable of it, not out of justice, but out of fear. Judith raised her eyes. Who? Poirot didn't reply. He just walked to the desk, took a blank sheet of paper, and began to write something very short. Then he folded it and handed it to her. Take it with you to the meeting. Read it only when I tell you to. Judith took the note with trembling hands. And what does it contain? The answer to the question you've been most afraid to ask. At 11 o'clock sharp, everyone was gathered in the greenhouse. The place, with its fogged-up windows and smell of damp earth, seemed the exact setting for what was about to happen. A funeral of secrets, an exhumation of the soul. Poirot stood in the center. The ring rested on a velvet cushion, like a crown without an owner. My lords and ladies, he began, we've come a long way, from a silent robbery to a death without a trace. But, as always happens, every crime, no matter how ingenious it may seem, is born from something very simple. Overwhelming emotion. He turned to Lydia. You understood before anyone else that Arabella was prepared to take her secret to the grave. But you weren't the only one who wanted to prevent it. He looked at Bellamy. You, father, have confessed your heart many times, but this time it's not yours that matters, but the heart of someone you protected. The vicar pursed his lips. Poirot continued. That morning, the tea was served by Bates, but it was carried by you, and on the way you were intercepted by the one person who knew Arabella would refuse to reveal the truth. The same person who had access to his medical bag. He turned slowly to Dr. Penrose. You didn't poison Arabella that morning, but he left his case open last night in the library, where someone else saw him. Someone desperate, someone hurt. Penrose tensed. Who? Poirot looked at Judith. Judith, open the note. She did so with fingers that trembled like leaves. She read silently, then her lips spoke barely. I did it for you, so you could live without his shadow. Forgive me. B. Everyone looked at Vicar Bellamy. No, Lydia whispered. Poirot spoke without harshness. He did it believing he was saving her. He believed that by killing Arabella he was protecting Judith from the weight of the truth, but he didn't understand that the truth doesn't disappear with Judith from the weight of the truth. But he didn't understand that the truth doesn't disappear with death, it only becomes another lie. Judith stood still. Then, with an inexplicable calm, she said, She didn't love me. She raised me out of duty. And he thought he could redeem me in his own way. The vicar was crying, silently. Poirot bowed and closed the ring case. The symbol has returned to its place. The crime has been revealed. But justice, my friends, isn't always a prison cell. Sometimes it's the chance to live knowing who you are. And who you are. And with that, the invisible curtain fell. Not with applause, but with a sigh. Chapter 10. Where Silence Dwells. When the greenhouse was empty, the house seemed to exhale, as if it had held its breath for decades, waiting for someone to say what no one dared to confess. There were no more secrets, at least not the same ones. But the truth, as Hercule Poirot well knew, did not bring immediate peace. The truth, when it comes late, brings a different kind of ruin. Vicar Bellamy had been led away by the police without resistance, not in handcuffs. Poirot had expressly requested it, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has already fallen inside. He had delivered his confession in a low voice, without embellishment, without drama. Just a gesture, barely a nod, when asked if he had poisoned Arabella Worthington with belladonna. I did it for her, he'd said once again, pointing at Judith. because the guilt of others weighed on her life. Inspector Morris, although surprised by the final twist, showed deference to Poirot. "Sometimes I wonder if emotions don't kill more people than guns," he said as he said goodbye. Poirot only responded with a slight gesture. "Emotions, Inspector, are like badly served tea. If you let it boil too much, it turns everything sour." That afternoon, the sky cleared for the first time in days. The garden, soaked by the previous night's rain, shone with a taut beauty, like a painting recovered from dust. Poirot, his hat perched firmly on his head and carrying a walking stick he rarely used, but today considered decorative, decided to walk the paths one last time. Judith accompanied him. She was no longer dressed in black, but in pearl grey, with a pale blue ribbon around her neck. It was a small gesture, but to Poirot it meant everything, a will to continue. "I don't know what to feel," she said, without looking at the ground or the sky. "There's no need to decide right away," he replied. "Emotions settle too. Some evaporate. Others stay forever. There's no method for living with what you learn too late." "And you? Have you always known what to do with the truth?" Poirot smiled softly. "Honestly, mademoiselle, it interests me the way a broken watch interests a watchmaker, because it reveals where the crack is. Not necessarily how to fix it, but how to prevent the next disaster." They stopped in front of the willow tree. Judith looked at it as if she saw something she hadn't known was there before. "My mother used to sit here," he said. "I barely remember her. But now I know why I always liked this corner. It was hers." Poirot didn't speak. He let her have that moment, intimate and complete. Then, in a low voice, he added, "Arabella lived in fear, not of scandal, but of losing control. That's why she hid the letter. That's why she took the ring. That's why she raised someone else's daughter as if she were another reflection of her power. But she didn't hate her, Judith. She just didn't know how to love anyone but herself." Judith closed her eyes. "I didn't hate her either, you know. But it did hurt. A lot. And I don't want that to be the only thing I have left of her." Poirot gently touched his shoulder. "Then remember also what you endured. Your strength. Your silence. Sometimes love, even misguided love, slips through the cracks of cruelty." When they returned to the house, Colonel Macfarlane was waiting for them at the entrance. He had a letter in his hand. His hand was shaking. "Monsieur Poirot, this is for you." Poirot took it. He opened it. It was a short note written in old-fashioned ink. Arabella Worthington, the heading, and below, just a single line. "If Judith ever asks, tell her, it wasn't your fault you were born from a broken promise. It was my cowardice that denied you your story." Poirot folded the note without reading it aloud. "Thank you, Colonel." The man stood on the threshold looking towards the horizon. She hated me for keeping quiet, but she also feared me, because I was the only thing that could destroy her version of events. Poirot nodded. "And now, what will you do?" The colonel looked at Judith, then left without saying a word. Lydia Fairfax left 2 days later. She said goodbye to Judith with a long, wordless hug. She left Poirot a letter with a single sentence. "We don't always paint what we see. Sometimes we paint what we want others to never see." When Poirot entered his room that morning, he lifted the sheet covering the easel. It was a portrait of Arabella Worthington, but not as she was, but as she perhaps once was, young, serene, free of masks. And behind her, in a shadow hinted at with just a few traces of blue, an even younger figure sitting under a tree. Judith. On the day of his departure, Poirot went down to the tea room for the last time. The silver tray had been polished. The chair by the piano had been removed. The clock struck 5. Judith approached and placed 2 cups. One for him, one for herself. "Will he ever come back?" he asked. Poirot smiled. "I don't know. But if I do it, I hope the ring is on the right side this time." Judith nodded. Then, after a pause, she said, "There's something strange. Since he died, I feel like the house breathes differently." "Oui," said Poirot, "because it no longer protects itself. Houses, like people, also tire of pretending." He took his hat. He turned to her one last time. "It's been a difficult case, mademoiselle. Not because of a lack of clues, but because of the depth of the soul. But it's also been a lesson about how silence doesn't always protect, and how love, when it becomes debt, ceases to be love." She walked him to the door. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, not only for solving it, but for listening to what I didn't even know I wanted to say." He looked at her deeply. "That, mademoiselle, is also part of the job." And he walked away with small, orderly steps toward the waiting train, toward the world where other crimes, other enigmas, would call him. But this case, it is case I would never forget, because it had been, deep down, a crime between blood and memory. A story not only of death, but of silence. Chapter 11. The Cup That Wasn't Empty. The train that was supposed to take Hercule Poirot back to London departed from Summerfield Station with English punctuality, but his seat remained empty. At the last minute, the Belgian detective had opted to stay one more night at Summerfield Chase, not out of formality, nor out of courtesy, but for something that didn't fit yet. I had solved the crime. Yes. The culprit had been identified, the motive explained, and justice, in its most tragic form, served. But Poirot did not rest solely on the revelation of the culprit. I needed to fully understand the logic of the soul. And something in the last few days told him he hadn't done it yet. That evening, the Summerfield dining room was lit by the dim light of a gas lamp. Only Judith and Poirot sat at the table. The servants, discreet, barely spoke. Since Arabella's death, the house had become even quieter, as if it had forgotten the tone of its own voice. "I didn't expect him to stay," Judith said, as she served soup. "Nor do I, mademoiselle," Poirot replied. But something prompted it. A point. Discomfort in the symmetry of events. Judith smiled bitterly. "Did the crime not seem elegant enough to you?" "It's not a question of aesthetics, but of balance. Solving a crime isn't just about pointing out the culprit, it's about understanding all the fabric, the tiny wrinkles, the invisible stitches, and there's a stitch here that still won't let me sleep." Judith put down her spoon. "What have you noticed?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers. "The cup." "What cup?" "The second cup on Arabella's tea tray. That morning Father Bellamy brought the tea, and he claimed to have seen 2 cups, one poured, one empty. But when Judith and I came in after her death, there was only one." Judith frowned. "Maybe the other one was withdrawn." "Exactly. But for whom? The servants didn't touch it. You didn't come in until I asked you to. And Bellamy, according to himself, didn't come back after leaving the tray. What if it was Arabella?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "Arabella was maniacally tidy. She wouldn't have left an empty cup for herself if the other one was already poured. If the cup was taken away, it was by someone who he didn't want us to know that another person was there that morning." Judith looked down. Something was beginning to form in her memory. Now that you mention it, I remember seeing a cup out of place that morning on the dining room sideboard. I thought some servant had forgotten it, but it was dry, as if it had been washed badly or if someone had been in a hurry. Poirot straightened up. Where is that cup now? I don't know. Maybe in the cupboard. Poirot stood up immediately. Judith followed him. They crossed the corridor in silence, went down to the kitchen, and entered the crockery area. There, on the top shelf, rested several identical, clean, white cups, but Poirot stopped before one in particular. Look here. On the inner edge, almost imperceptible, a yellowish residue. Poirot held it with a handkerchief and sniffed. Belladonna, diluted enough to be unnoticeable, but still active. Judith took a step back. So, it was someone else? Poirot turned towards her. No, mademoiselle, it was the same person, Father Bellamy. But now I see it clearly. He did not act alone. Judith was paralyzed. Who? Poirot looked towards the cellar entrance. He opened the door. The light from the hallway illuminated the stone stairs. Below, a figure slowly emerged. Era Peter, the young gardener. His face was pale, his hands were stained with dirt. I didn't mean to kill anyone, he said, his voice breaking. I just wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Judith took a step toward him, confused. What are you talking about? Peter looked at her as if he could finally say what he had been waiting for years. Arabella destroyed my mother. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Your mother, was it? Mary Tilson, Peter said with a sigh that seemed centuries old. She was a servant here. 20 years ago. Arabella fired her last night. No explanation. She said she stole something, but it was never true. Judith murmured, My aunt never told me about her. It wasn't convenient for him. Mary was pregnant. The father was never found out. Poirot lowered his voice. And you, Peter, were born months later. Yes. She raised me alone. She raised me in secret. She never spoke ill of Arabella, but she feared her. I came here a year ago as a gardener, to see with my own eyes what kind of person she was, to understand why she destroyed her. And what did you find? Peter swallowed. I found Judith. I saw her sweetness, her gaze, her silences, and I understood that she too had been raised in shadows. Judith stood still, as if her own story were being read to her for the first time. Did you place the second cup? Peter nodded. Bellamy saw me hiding one day in the garden. He recognized me. He let me be. He talked to me. And when I told him what my mother had experienced, he said he knew things too, that Arabella had lied to many people, that she should pay. He said we couldn't kill her, that we should just scare her, get the ring back, force her to talk. And then? The night before she died, Bellamy told me that the plan would change, that Arabella, I was going to confess everything that same morning. But then she died. And I knew he'd poisoned her, that he'd despaired. Judith whispered. And that's why he hid the second cup. Peter nodded. I washed her. I hid her. I didn't want them to think Bellamy didn't act alone. I didn't kill her. But I did help set the scene. Poirot looked at him for a long time. And why didn't you tell the police before? Because I thought you'd know. That I wouldn't need to tell you. And because I was afraid Judith would hate me too. Judith walked towards him, speechless. I didn't know you'd suffered so much, he finally said. But I don't hate you. Not for wanting to know the truth. Poirot leaned towards Peter. Justice isn't just about the courts. Sometimes it's about understanding. And you, young Peter, have understood the pain. But you haven't crossed the line. Leave the judgment to the law, and to the heart, what only forgiveness can heal. That evening, Poirot packed his suitcase again. But before leaving, he placed a small note on Judith's desk. It just said, "Not all crimes are punishable. Some are inherited. And yet, there are always those who choose to stop the chain. With gratitude, H. Poirot." And this time, he did take the train. But in his mind, Summerfield Chase didn't disappear, because it had been a house where death only came after the truth began to breathe. Chapter 12. The Footprints That Left No Mud. The next morning at Summerfield Chase was strangely serene, as if the house, after so many decades of hushed voices and porcelain secrets, was breathing without fear for the first time. There was something different about the air, not freshness, but rest. Judith woke up early, not knowing why. Her dreams had been filled with stairs leading up to ceilingless roofs. For the first time in a long time, she didn't hear the clinking of the cup Aunt Arabella used. The house was quiet, but no longer the kind of silence that hid things. It was, rather, quiet, but no longer the kind of silence that hid things. It was, rather, the silence that remains when a confession has been made. The kind of silence that has form. Poirot's note still lay on the desk in the living room. Judith had read it so many times she could recite it by heart. But she hadn't moved it. It seemed to her that if she did, the thread of something very fragile might snap, as if she were still hearing his voice between the letters. At noon, Inspector Holloway arrived at Summerfield. Not with the arrogance of someone seeking to close a case, but with the humility of someone who has witnessed something beyond his reach. "Are you okay, Miss Judith?" She nodded. She offered him tea. She poured him 1 cup, less than usual. "Did you receive Monsieur Poirot's report?" she asked. Holloway nodded, with the expression of someone who had read a difficult gospel. "Yes? Although I confess I had to read it 3 times. It's a document that's as human as it is deductive." That was him. Holloway let a moment pass before adding, "Peter Tilson has been questioned. We haven't arrested him. There's no provable crime that warrants immediate sentencing. The young man has agreed to appear if requested. He wasn't a murderer. But it was dangerously close." Judith looked down. Inside her, unanswered questions were still swirling. Questions that didn't make a sound, but that took up space. "Can I ask you something, Inspector?" "Of course. Do you think that justice has been served?" Holloway took his time. He stirred the unsweetened tea. He looked out the window at the garden, where Peter had planted some rose bushes weeks ago that wouldn't bloom until the following summer. "I don't know," he replied with strange sincerity. "Sometimes I think justice doesn't always seek punishment. Sometimes it's just making sure something doesn't happen again." Judith didn't respond. But a part of her, the part that had been raised between Arabella's severity and the fear of making invisible mistakes, felt that the idea was like a coat in winter. Later, Judith went down to the basement, the place where Peter had emerged the night before. She found nothing there, no footprints, no forgotten objects, no confessions written on the wall. But when she touched one of the wooden beams, she felt something wet, as if a tear that hadn't been cried was still waiting to flow. On the stone, he found a small wildflower. It wasn't growing there. Someone had left it. Maybe Peter. Perhaps she herself, once upon a time. Returning to the hall, he saw a letter on the console. It was from the London notary's office. He opened it with trembling fingers. The contents were brief. "Mrs. Judith Bellamy. According to the final instructions in Arabella Chase's updated will, you are the sole heir to the entire estate, except for a ring that was to be personally presented to whomever she deemed most worthy. Judith closed her eyes. The ring had disappeared. Poirot never mentioned it in his report. Peter doesn't either, and yet somehow he knew he had found his destiny. It wasn't a valuable object. It was a symbol. And symbols, he thought, only have value when they are buried or returned. That night, Judith walked alone toward the garden. She was carrying a small package wrapped in grey cloth. Inside was the ring Arabella had hidden. She didn't know how it had gotten back to her. She only knew that it was there, as if the house itself had returned it. He approached the youngest rosebush, one that hadn't yet bloomed, and dug a small hole. There he buried it. Not like someone hiding something, but like someone giving it back to the earth. "To you, mother of no one," he whispered. "To you, nameless daughter." And the wind blew. Not strong, not violent, just enough to extinguish a candle that had already served its purpose. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in Belgium at Monsieur Hercule Poirot's address. Inside, a letter in Judith's own handwriting. It read, "You said some crimes are inherited. I believe the decisions to break them are also inherited. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. The garden will bloom. With affection and gratitude, Judith." Poirot, having finished reading, folded the letter with a slight smile. Then he went to his bookcase and placed the envelope next to a small box marked Casso Summerfield. He closed the case. He placed it on the top shelf, where things that no longer need sorting go, only remembered. And so ended the case of the cup that was not emptied. Or maybe it didn't end. Maybe it just turned into something more. A story where the poison wasn't just in the tea, but in what families kept quiet about, and where, for once, someone chose to speak. Chapter 13. The Echo of Things Unsaid. Paddington Station was surrounded by the constant murmur of footsteps, whistles, and barely whispered conversations. The train from Summerfield Chase arrived punctually. From the crowd stepped Hercule Poirot, his grey coat neatly buttoned, his moustache untouched, but his thoughts still suspended in another house, another hour, another cup. He walked leisurely to Whitehaven Mansions, his London home, where Georges, his faithful servant, greeted him with a slight bow. "Have a good trip, sir?" Quiet, although I can't say it was silent. Georges didn't ask any more questions. He knew that Poirot's silence didn't mean peace, but thought. And that thought still smelled of belladonna. Back in his office, Poirot removed his hat, placed it neatly on the coat rack, and sat down at his desk. From his suitcase, he took a folded envelope. He hadn't opened it yet. Not out of carelessness, but out of respect. It was the letter Judith had slipped under her bedroom door the morning of her departure. He delicately opened the envelope. The paper smelled of the same ink used to write confessions that seek not absolution, but understanding. "Mr. Poirot, you said that not all crimes are punished, and I believe there are others that are committed silently for years, like rain that falls silently but soaks everything. Arabella destroyed many lives, but I lived mine believing that was normal, that the truth was kept quiet out of politeness. You came and didn't just solve a crime. You taught me that sometimes justice means looking someone in the eye and saying, 'I know what you did, but I won't let that make me the same.' Peter has left. He left me a dried flower between the pages of a book I'd forgotten. He said his mother gave it to him to protect him from the winter. I don't think he was just talking about the weather. Thank you, sir. for teaching me that you don't have to inherit your shadow if you learn to light your own lamp. Judith. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. The letter held no surprises. It held peace, which is different and stranger. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the London sky was beginning to turn grey. From there, the houses looked the same, but he knew each one hid a cup, full or empty, dirty or clean, seen or gone. And sometimes those cups spoke more of a house's history than record books or wills. He returned to his desk, with books or wills. He returned to his desk. He opened his casebook and, under the heading Summerfield Chase, the cup that wasn't empty, wrote a final line. Poison doesn't always kill. Sometimes the silence that accompanies it does. And then he closed the notebook, not with drama, but with precision. Because this time the case wasn't just about murder. It was about invisible chains, about forgotten names, about unacknowledged children, and about women who, like Judith, chose not to repeat what they had learned. Poirot, who could detect a lie in a pause or a confession in the quiver of an eyelash, understood this better than anyone. The crime had been punished, but more importantly, he had been understood. He leaned forward and pressed the bell to call Georges. "Yes, sir?" "No coffee tonight. Just a cup of tea, strong and simple." "With sugar?" Poirot smiled. Not this time, because there were things that, finally, tasted good, without needing to be sweetened. Chapter 12. The Wound That Was Also a Key. The next morning brought with it a thick fog, as if the countryside around Summerfield Chase had decided to fall silent for another day. Judith watched from her bedroom window as the greyish light blurred the contours of the garden. Down below, among the hedges, still damp with dew, she saw Peter moving about. With a firm but measured step, he was placing new plants in the ground, as if he didn't yet know which world he belonged to. Poirot, meanwhile, remained in the library, silently reviewing the series of events that had led him there. The crime was solved on the surface, but not in depth, and that, he knew well, was the difference between justice and reparation. Arabella's case had begun as a mystery involving poison and stolen rings, but now it exuded the dark undertones of a secret genealogy, a humiliation that was not forgotten, and a house where words never reached where they should. The clock struck 10 when Judith entered, carrying with her an old notebook that she held against her chest. "I want to show you something," he said bluntly. "I found it last night, in my aunt's room." Poirot took it carefully. The leather was cracked with age. On the first page, written in elegant handwriting, was the following: Journal d'Arabella T. Carrington. "I didn't know she kept a diary," Judith added, looking down at the floor. "Or maybe I did, but I never thought she'd open it." Poirot flipped through the pages cautiously. The first entries were trivial: guests, gardens, dinners. But then, like a rising undercurrent, the tone changed. "Mary Tilson is late again. She says she feels sick, but I saw her laughing with the gardener. She lied to me. They all do. I fired her. I can't allow it to happen again. This house needs order. It needs silence. Kindness is a crack through which chaos enters." Poirot slowly closed the diary. "How old were you when that happened?" 6, Judith replied. "I remember one morning Mum and Aunt Arabella had an argument. Then Mary disappeared. I never knew why, I just remember the house getting colder." "And your mother? Did she talk to you about her?" "Number." But sometimes he would stop in front of the greenhouse, as if remembering something that should no longer have a name. Poirot nodded. The silence at Summerfield Chase was no accident. It was an inherited act, a mandate. "Mademoiselle Judith," he said at last, "would you like the story to end here?" Judith was startled. "What do you say?" "The case has been solved. Peter has confessed to his role, albeit a minor one. Father Bellamy is no longer with us. I could present this notebook to the police. We could take the matter before a judge. But the question is, what kind of justice do you want?" Judith took a deep breath. She looked at the notebook. She looked at her hands. "I don't want revenge. I don't want to see Peter punished for wanting to understand. But I also don't want this to be forgotten as if it never happened. What Arabella did wasn't just cruel. It was systematic. It was invisible, like a windowless room where you get used to not seeing." Poirot stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. "Then let's not forget it, mademoiselle. But let's not perpetuate it either. Justice sometimes doesn't need bars. It needs words, memory, decisions different from those of yesterday." Judith nodded. "So what do we do with this?" he asked, pointing at the journal. "I suggest you keep it, not as a relic, but as a warning. And if you ever have a daughter, perhaps she'll read it to her. Not so she'll know who Arabella was, but so she'll understand who you were when you broke the cycle." A meaningful silence fell over the room. Shortly after, Poirot went for a walk in the gardens. He found Peter by the pond, stirring the earth with a spade. Seeing him, the young man sat up with a mixture of guilt and hope. "Are you coming to tell me I have to leave?" "No, sir. I came to ask if you'd like to stay." Peter blinked. "Stay?" Poirot sat down on a wrought iron bench. "Judith has read your aunt's diary. She knows what you suffered. She knows what you tried to do. And yet, she wants you to have a chance." Peter looked down. "I don't deserve it." "And who decides that, young man? The dead? The empty cups? Or the living who choose how to fill the next ones?" Peter stood still. "I only came here to understand why my mother suffered. But I ended up finding another kind of route." Poirot smiled tenderly. "Sometimes you dig looking for a body and you find a seed." The young man nodded with moist eyes. "I'll stay, if she allows me, and if the land allows it." That afternoon at Summerfield Chase, doors that had remained closed for years began to open. Arabella's office was aired out. The portrait of a stern ancestor was removed from the main hall, and in the library, Judith placed a new notebook on the middle shelf, untitled. Just a small blue ribbon tied around its spine. A symbol, perhaps, of something that was just beginning. Poirot, for his part, silently packed his suitcase. This time, without hesitation. Logic had been restored, not just in actions, in souls as well. Before closing the suitcase, he took out an envelope. Inside, a letter he had written for Inspector Greaves, explaining the details of the case with mathematical precision, but concluding with a remark. "I suggest not filing charges against Peter Tilson. The evidence doesn't point to criminal intent, but rather to an emotional complicity born of a silenced truth. Justice, in this case, has already been served, and not poisoned." He put away the letter and closed the suitcase. In the hallway, Judith was waiting for him. They both knew it was their farewell. "Thank you, sir," she said, "not only for solving what happened, but for showing us what can still happen." Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you, mademoiselle, for having the courage to look back and keep walking." And without further ado, the detective left Summerfield Chase, not with the satisfaction of a closed case, but with the serenity of a wound recognized, faced, and perhaps beginning to heal.